A millionaire has an accident and becomes completely dependent. Desperate, he hires a young poor woman to help him with his bath. She enters the bathroom, and the silence turns into tension in the air. But what happens inside will shock even the most skeptical. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. The crystal chandelier tinkled softly to the ambient music, while champagne flutes circulated among the elegantly dressed guests. Richard Miller adjusted his Italian silk tie, an automatic gesture that had long lost its meaning. His reflection in the golden mirror of the main hall showed the impeccable image of the CEO of Miller Technologies, but his brown eyes betrayed a restlessness that even his rehearsed smile couldn't mask. The award ceremony for the year's most innovative companies was at its peak. His company once again occupied first place in the rankings. Helen Turner, his business partner, delivered the acceptance speech with her usual poise, while he remained a few steps behind, like a well-dressed statue. "And we owe all this success to Richard Miller's extraordinary vision," announced Helen, turning to him with a calculated smile. Applause echoed through the hall, but to Richard it sounded like a distant and suffocating buzz. The air began to feel scarce. The walls of the luxurious hotel seemed to compress around him. The smiles, the congratulations, the pats on the back, everything transformed into a fog of falsity that engulfed him. Without thinking twice, Richard crossed the hall toward the exit, ignoring the surprised looks and Helen's calls. The New York night welcomed him with a cool breeze. His Porsche waited in the reserved spot, but something prevented him from getting into the car. His feet began to move along the sidewalk, first in slow steps, then in a determined walk. The familiar streets of the financial district were left behind, giving way to older neighborhoods, with their preserved architectural houses and century-old trees. As he walked, memories he had tried so hard to bury began to emerge. The smell of breakfast prepared by his mother, the laughter of games with neighborhood friends, the creaking of the iron gate that announced his father's arrival after a day's work. Memories of a time when success wasn't measured by numbers on a spreadsheet. Without realizing it, his steps led him to 237 Maple Street. The house of his childhood remained there, with its faded blue facade and the small garden where his mother used to cultivate roses. The property was for sale, a discreet sign fixed on the low wall. Richard sat on the curb, allowing himself, for the first time in years, to feel the weight of all the choices that had taken him away from that place. The sound of soft music came from one of the neighboring houses, mixing with the distant noise of traffic. A woman sitting on cardboard on the opposite sidewalk observed him with curiosity. Her eyes, despite her apparent homelessness, conveyed a serenity that intrigued him. That's when the lights of a truck illuminated the street. The Miller Technologies logo shone on the side of the vehicle approaching at high speed. Richard realized too late that the driver had lost control. The impact was inevitable. The last thing his eyes registered before everything went dark was the woman from the sidewalk, running toward him, her lips moving in a silent scream, and, curiously, a small blue butterfly that flew by, its silhouette outlined against the night sky of New York. Fate sometimes chooses the most unlikely moments to change the course of a life. For Richard Miller, it took a complete collapse, emotional and physical, for him to finally see beyond the walls of glass and steel he had built around himself. But this would only be the first page of a story that was about to transform into something much greater than he could ever imagine. The awakening was gradual, like emerging from a dense and confusing dream. The sounds came first, the rhythmic beep of monitors, muffled conversations in the hallway, the whisper of air conditioning. Richard opened his eyes slowly, adapting to the soft light that entered through the hospital room window. Helen was seated in a nearby armchair, furiously typing on her tablet. Upon noticing he had awakened, she approached with an expression that mixed relief and concern. "Finally, Richard, you gave us quite a scare." He tried to move, but his body didn't respond as expected. A strange sensation, as if he were disconnected from his own legs, made him furrow his brow. "What happened?" His voice came out hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "You had an accident." "One of our trucks," Helen hesitated, nervously adjusting her impeccable blazer. "But don't worry, everything's under control. The press doesn't know anything, and we'll keep it that way." Richard barely heard his partner's words. His attention was focused on the impossibility of moving his legs, a realization that was beginning to take shape in his mind, cold and frightening. A doctor entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Paul Reynolds. You suffered a severe spinal cord injury. We performed emergency surgery, but..." The doctor paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's permanent damage that will require a long rehabilitation process." The words fell like stones in a deep lake, creating waves that reverberated throughout his being. Helen immediately began talking about international specialists and experimental treatments, but Richard was no longer listening. His eyes had found, through the window, a small blue butterfly perched on the windowsill. "Where's the woman?" he suddenly asked, interrupting Helen's monologue. "What woman?" she responded, confused. "The woman who helped me, she was on the street." "Oh yes, a homeless woman who called the ambulance. Don't worry, she was adequately rewarded," Helen Cedar replied with a dismissive gesture. At that moment, a nurse entered the room pushing a wheelchair. "It's time for your first physical therapy session, Mr. Miller." The metal object gleamed under the sunlight, like an unwanted throne that would now be part of his life. With the help of professionals, Richard was transferred to the chair. The process was humiliating and painful, not just physically. Each movement was a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. As he was led through the hospital corridors, he observed his distorted reflection in the mirrored surfaces, no longer the untouchable CEO, but a broken, vulnerable, human man. The physical therapy room was spacious and bright. Various equipment occupied the space, and other people performed their exercises with different degrees of difficulty. That's when he saw her for the first time. Elizabeth Walker, his physical therapist, a woman of about 35, with kind eyes and a firm posture. "Welcome, Richard," she said with a serene smile, without showing the slightest sign of intimidation at his status. "Shall we begin our journey together?" Beside her, a small girl was drawing intently at a table in the corner of the room. Her strokes were delicate and precise, and it wasn't difficult to notice that there was something special in her focused gaze and methodical movements. "My daughter Sophie," Elizabeth introduced, noticing Richard's interest. The girl briefly raised her eyes from the drawing, offering a small smile before returning to her art. On the paper, a sequence of blue butterflies was taking shape, their wings painted with extraordinary care. Richard felt something inexplicable in that moment, as if those butterflies held a meaning he couldn't yet understand. It was the beginning of a transformation that would go far beyond physical recovery, but he didn't know that yet. For now, he was just a man trying to find the strength to face the first day of the rest of his life. The weeks dragged on at the rehabilitation center with torturous slowness. Richard watched each minute pass on the wall clock while his body fought against limitations he had never imagined facing. The sessions with Elizabeth were intense, not only because of the physical effort, but mainly because of the internal struggle he waged with himself. "You need to trust the process," Elizabeth repeated patiently as she helped him with the exercises. "Your body is learning a new way to exist." Richard, however, remained closed in his fortress of silence. The only people he interacted with were Elizabeth and occasionally Sophie, who continued to appear in the physical therapy room with her. Enigmatic drawings, Helen visited sporadically, always with company reports and news about how she was keeping his absence away from the spotlight. On a particularly difficult afternoon, after an exhausting session, Richard remained in the physical therapy room. Beyond the usual time, Sophie was in her usual corner, concentrating on another of her drawings. Without him noticing, the girl approached his wheelchair. "Do you see them too?" Sophie asked, her voice soft and melodious. "See what?" Richard replied, surprised by the initiative of the girl who rarely spoke. "The blue butterflies. They appear when someone is going to change," she explained, extending her most recent drawing. In it, a figure in a wheelchair was surrounded by blue butterflies in full flight. Something in the simplicity of that conversation touched Richard deeply. It was the first time since the accident that someone had addressed him without pity or professional expectations. Sophie saw him simply as he was at that moment. Elizabeth, who was discreetly observing the scene, approached with a warm smile. "Sophie has a special way of perceiving people," she explained. "She's on the autism spectrum, but I prefer to say she's on the spectrum of sensitivity." That night, alone in his hospital room, Richard found himself thinking about the conversation with Sophie. He remembered the blue butterfly he had seen moments before the accident, and a shiver ran down his spine. For the first time, he allowed himself to question if there was something greater behind everything he was experiencing. The next morning, when Elizabeth arrived for the session, she found Richard already positioned near the equipment, a new determination in his gaze. "Teach me," he said simply. "Teach me to live in this new way." Elizabeth smiled, recognizing in those words the first real sign of openness. "Let's start with something different today," she proposed, guiding his chair to a table with clay. "Sometimes we need to create something new with our own hands to remember what we're capable of." As they worked with the clay, Sophie approached, again this time bringing her colors. The three spent the morning modeling and painting, creating shapes that gradually came to life. Richard found himself smiling, a gesture that for weeks seemed to have forgotten how to do. "You know," Elizabeth commented as they cleaned their hands, "the most difficult transformation isn't of the body, it's of the soul." Richard nodded, understanding for the first time the true meaning of those words. That night, before sleeping, he opened the drawer of his bedside table and took out the drawings Sophie had given him. The blue butterflies seemed to dance on the paper, as if they held a secret that was gradually beginning to reveal itself. In the hallway, invisible through the closed door, a real blue butterfly gently landed on the doorframe, its wings shining, under the hospital's nightlight. It was as if the universe was silently conspiring, weaving the threads of a story that was just beginning to unfold. Autumn arrived, bringing a gentle change in temperature and the colors of the city. Richard was already in his third month of rehabilitation, and the progress, although slow, was beginning to become visible. His relationship with Elizabeth and Sophie was also evolving, transforming into something he didn't yet know how to name. But that warmed his heart in a long-forgotten way. During a particularly challenging session, while trying to strengthen his arm muscles, Richard noticed that Sophie was especially agitated. The girl was rocking slightly in her chair, a behavior that Elizabeth had explained was common when she was processing intense emotions. "Sophie had a difficult day at school today," Elizabeth commented softly while adjusting the equipment. "Some children don't always understand that being different doesn't mean being less." Richard interrupted his exercises, observing the girl with renewed attention. "Can I take a break?" he asked Elizabeth, who nodded with an understanding smile. He maneuvered his chair to the table where Sophie was drawing, positioning himself beside her. "You know, Sophie, when I was a child, I also felt different sometimes," he began, his voice soft and gentle. The girl continued drawing, but her rocking diminished slightly, indicating she was listening. "I was the boy who preferred reading to playing football, who dreamed about machines and inventions while others wanted to be football players," he continued. "For a long time I thought I needed to change to fit in. I ended up changing so much that I lost myself." Sophie stopped drawing, her eyes meeting Richard's for the first time that day. "The butterflies know who you really are," she said, with surprising conviction. Elizabeth, who was discreetly observing the scene, felt her eyes water. It was rare to see her daughter connect so deeply with someone outside her small circle of trust. "Then tell me, Sophie, who do you think I really am?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. The girl took a new paper and began drawing rapidly. Minutes later, she handed Richard a drawing where a wheelchair figure appeared surrounded by children, all with butterfly wings. In the center of the drawing, the words "flight teacher" were written in childish letters. Richard felt something break inside him, not painfully, but as if an invisible wall finally collapsed. Tears, which he had kept dammed for years, began to stream down his face. Elizabeth approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes we need to lose ourselves to truly find ourselves," she said softly. That night, in his adapted apartment, Richard couldn't sleep. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. Flight teacher. It was a title so distant from CEO, Businessman of the Year, or any other designation he had ever received, but somehow it seemed truer than all the others. Sitting by the window, he observed the city lights when his phone rang. It was Helen with another update about the company, but this time something had changed in his perspective. While listening to the numbers and statistics, an idea began to take shape in his mind. "Helen," he interrupted, "I need you to research something for me. I want to know everything about assistive technology and inclusive education." "What?" "Richard, you need to focus on your recovery and return to the company," Helen responded, confused. "Exactly," he said, a smile forming on his lips. "And that's what I'm doing. Except, maybe the return will be different than we imagined." After hanging up the phone, Richard took a notebook and began to write. Ideas flowed like a long dammed river. In the upper corner of the page, he drew a small blue butterfly, not as perfect as Sophie's, but laden with meaning. The announcement fell like a bomb at the board meeting. Richard, through a video conference, had just communicated his decision to sell his penthouse apartment and use part of his shares in the company to finance a social project. Helen, who until then had maintained a controlled posture, couldn't disguise her discomfort. "Richard, you're not thinking clearly," she argued, nervously adjusting her designer glasses. "This difficult phase will pass, and you'll regret decisions made in the heat of the moment." But there was a different serenity on Richard's face, visible even through the computer screen. "For the first time in a long time, Helen, I'm thinking with absolute clarity," he responded, his voice firm and calm. In the following weeks, the move to a single-story house in the Brooklyn neighborhood caused a stir in New York's high society. The property, though comfortable, was incomparably more modest than his former penthouse. Richard personally supervised the necessary adaptations, transforming the space into something welcoming and accessible. During this process, he discovered an old photograph that had fallen behind one of the house's pieces of furniture. The image showed a smiling family in front of a moving truck, the same type of truck that had hit him on that fateful night. Intrigued, he kept the photo to investigate later. On a particularly busy afternoon of home adaptations, Elizabeth arrived for an unscheduled visit. Sophie accompanied her, carrying her inseparable folder of drawings. The girl immediately fell in love with the backyard, where several plants needed care. "Sorry to appear without warning," Elizabeth began, while watching Sophie explore the green space. But Sophie wouldn't stop talking about coming to see your new house. She said the butterflies called her. Richard smiled, already accustomed to the girl's unique perceptions. "You arrived at the perfect moment. I'm trying to decide what to do with this garden." Sophie, who was crouched near an abandoned flower bed, raised her voice. "It could be a place for people to learn to fly again." Elizabeth and Richard exchanged significant looks. "You know," Elizabeth began hesitantly, "there's a therapy called horticulture. Working with plants can be incredibly restorative for people in recovery." Richard's mind began to work quickly. The garden was spacious enough to create different environments. There could be an area for therapy, another for socializing, perhaps even a space for outdoor workshops. "Sophie," he called, "would you like to help me design how this garden could be?" The girl's eyes sparkled with the proposal. She quickly opened her folder, spreading papers on a nearby garden table. Together, they began to dream about what that space could become. While they worked on the drawings, Elizabeth observed the interaction with tearful eyes. It was rare to see her daughter so at ease with someone, freely sharing her thoughts and ideas. There was something special happening there, something that went beyond a simple garden project. At the end of the afternoon, when Elizabeth and Sophie were leaving, the girl gave Richard her final drawing, a space full of life with people in wheelchairs caring for plants, children playing, and of course, blue butterflies flying everywhere. "I'll call it the Butterfly Garden," Sophie declared with conviction. That night after they left, Richard remained in the garden, observing the twilight. The gentle breeze moved the tree leaves, creating dancing shadows on the ground. In his mind, the project he had been idealizing began to take more concrete form. He took his tablet and began researching innovative rehabilitation centers around the world. He wanted to create something different, a place that not only helped people recover, but made them rediscover their own strength. The photograph found behind the furniture wouldn't leave Richard's mind. After some research and phone calls, he discovered that the house had belonged to the Williams family. The surname led him to a surprising revelation. The driver of the truck that had hit him was Charlie Williams, Elizabeth's uncle. The discovery stunned him. For days, he debated internally about how to approach the subject. It was on a quiet afternoon while supervising the work in the garden that Elizabeth arrived for one of her regular visits. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice softer than normal. He showed the photograph to Elizabeth, who paled upon recognizing the people in the image. "My Uncle Charlie," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. He hasn't been the same since the accident. Actually, that day, he tried. "'Cause," Richard gently completed, understanding the dimension of the situation. Elizabeth nodded, unable to pronounce the words. "You knew from the beginning who I was?" asked Richard, with no accusation in his voice, just curiosity. "Yes," Elizabeth admitted. "But you needed a physical therapist, not someone judging you or apologizing. And with time, well, you became much more than a patient to us." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of workers' tools in the garden and the singing of birds. Sophie, who was playing nearby with her paints, approached silently, sensing the emotional energy of the moment. "The butterflies." "New," she said simply, looking from one adult to the other. "They always know when people need to meet." Richard smiled, realizing the profound wisdom in the girl's seemingly simple words. "You're right, Sophie, and I think I know exactly what we need to do now." In the following days, Richard organized a meeting with Charlie Williams. The man arrived in the garden on a Sunday morning, his hands trembling slightly as he held his worn hat. His eyes avoided meeting Richard's. "Mr. Miller, he began, but Richard gently interrupted him. "Charlie, do you like gardens?" he asked, surprising the man with the unexpected question. "Yes, I've always liked them. Actually, before being a driver, Charlie hesitated. "We're a landscaper," Richard completed, having done his research. "And that's why I want to make you a proposal. This garden needs someone who understands not just plants but healing, someone who knows that sometimes we need to fall to learn to get up again." Charlie looked around, noticing for the first time the flower beds under construction, the areas delimited for different therapeutic activities. His eyes shone with an interest he hadn't shown for a long time. "But after what happened, how can you trust me?" he asked, his voice choked. "Because we all deserve a second chance," Richard responded, extending his hand, "and because sometimes the accidents of fate are actually predestined encounters." Sophie, who was observing the scene from her usual corner, stood up and walked over to them carrying one of her drawings. In it, 2 blue butterflies flew in a spiral, their wings touching lightly in the center of the page. "Sometimes we need to break to learn to fly again," she said, handing the drawing to Charlie, who received it with trembling hands. At that moment, a gentle breeze crossed the garden, carrying petals and promises of renewal. The Center for Inclusion and Assistive Technology was beginning to gain not only physical form but also its soul. The center's work advanced rapidly, transforming the property into a welcoming and functional space. The garden, under Charlie's dedicated care, flourished in a surprising way. Therapeutic flower beds took shape, creating different sensory environments that Sophie loved to explore. However, the first public presentation of the project didn't go as planned. During an event for potential partners and families, Sophie was scheduled to give a small presentation about her vision for the therapeutic garden. The girl had rehearsed for days, overcoming her natural introversion through her excitement to share her dreams for the space. The improvised auditorium was full, with representatives from various institutions and families interested in the project. Sophie climbed to the small stage, her hands firmly clutching her folder of drawings. But before she could begin, a strident voice sounded from the audience. "Look, the weird girl is going to speak," mocked a boy in the first row, the son of one of the investors present. Nervous laughter echoed through the environment. Sophie's face paled. Her eyes desperately searched for her mother in the audience, while her hands began to tremble. Elizabeth made a motion to get up, but Richard was faster. With precise movements in his wheelchair, he positioned himself beside Sophie on the stage. "You know," he began, his voice calm but firm, filling the environment. "When I was the powerful CEO of Miller Technologies, I thought I knew everything about innovation. But it took a special girl to teach me that the greatest inventions are born when we learn to see the world through different eyes." Sophie, still trembling slightly, found the strength to open her folder. Richard continued, "Each drawing here tells a story of transformation. Each blue butterfly represents someone who discovered their own strength." The girl began to display her drawings on a nearby easel, her hands still unstable, but her movements gradually gaining confidence. The images spoke for themselves. People in wheelchairs caring for plants, children with different abilities playing together, blue butterflies connecting everyone in a harmonious dance. "The Inclusion Center is not just a rehabilitation project," Richard continued, observing how the audience now paid full attention. "It's a place where our differences are not obstacles, but the very wings that allow us to fly." The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause. The boy who had mocked shrank in his chair while his father observed him with a severe expression. But it was what happened next that surprised everyone. Sophie, recovering her voice, pointed to her most recent drawing, a representation of the garden seen from above, where the flower beds formed the outline of a huge butterfly. "Butterflies," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Don't judge other butterflies for flying differently." The impact of her words was immediate. Several people in the audience had tears in their eyes. An elderly lady in a wheelchair approached the stage, took one of Sophie's drawings, and declared that she would like to be the first volunteer for the project. However, after the event, Sophie entered a period of selective silence. The trauma of the experience deeply affected her, and she began to communicate only through her drawings. Elizabeth was devastated, blaming herself for having exposed her daughter to such a stressful situation. Richard, observing the suffering of both, began to develop an idea. In his office, among architectural projects and financial spreadsheets, a new concept began to take shape, a communication system based on art and symbols, which would allow people with different forms of expression to connect. At night, while the center quieted, he remained in his office working tirelessly. On the wall, Sophie's drawings formed an inspiring mosaic, constantly reminding him of the true purpose of it all. On his desk, a single blue butterfly perched on a leaf seemed to observe his work, like a silent guardian of transformations yet to come. The communication system developed by Richard began as a series of colored cards with symbols inspired by Sophie's drawings. Each symbol represented an emotion, a need, or a thought. Blue butterflies naturally became the central symbol of the project, representing transformation and hope. One afternoon, while working in his adapted office, Richard received an unexpected visit. Helen Turner entered without being announced, her high heels echoing on the wooden floor. She carried a thick folder of documents and a concerned expression. "Richard, we need to talk," she began, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "The shareholders are restless. Your recent financial movements, this change of direction, is affecting market confidence." Before Richard could respond, a soft noise caught the attention of both. Sophie was standing at the door, holding one of her communication cards. On it, a blue butterfly carried a golden key. "Come in, Sophie," Richard invited gently. The girl approached, placing more cards on the table. Helen observed the scene with a mixture of confusion and impatience. "What is this?" she asked, picking up one of the cards. "This, Helen, is the future," Richard responded, a determined gleam in his eyes. "A communication system that allows people with different forms of expression to connect. Sophie has been helping us develop Joyce, the girl began to arrange the cards in a specific sequence. The first showed a closed chrysalis, the second a chrysalis opening, and the third a butterfly in full flight. Below each image, simple words completed the message: fear, courage, freedom. Helen found herself observing the sequence with involuntary interest. It's interesting, she admitted reluctantly, but how does this translate into value for the company? Value? Richard smiled. Helen, what do you see when you look at these cards? Childish drawings, she promptly responded. I see bridges, Richard continued. Bridges between worlds that seemed impossible to connect. And what if we could adapt this system for companies? Imagine the impact on corporate communication, on the inclusion of neurodivergent professionals. Sophie silently placed a new card on the table. On it, a blue butterfly carried a golden coin. Helen couldn't contain a smile. She's smart, she commented, beginning to see the potential of the project. She's brilliant, Richard corrected affectionately, and she's teaching us a new way to see the world. At that moment, Elizabeth appeared at the door, surprised to find her daughter there. But before she could say anything, Sophie did something extraordinary. She took a blank card and, for the first time in weeks, began to draw right there, in front of everyone. The drawing showed 4 figures: a woman in executive attire, a man in a wheelchair, a small girl, and a woman in a physical therapist's coat. All had small butterfly wings on their backs. Family, Sophie whispered, her soft voice breaking weeks of silence. Helen observed the scene with watery eyes, her initial resistance dissolving before the pure emotion of the moment. Richard realized that something was changing, not just in Sophie, but in everyone present. Perhaps, he said softly, true value cannot be measured in spreadsheets and graphs. That night, after everyone left, Richard remained in his office, observing the cards spread across his desk. The system that had begun as a way to help Sophie was transforming into something much bigger. In his mind, ideas for expansion and adaptation of the project began to take shape. On the wall, the mosaic of Sophie's drawings seemed to come alive under the twilight light, and there, among so many blue butterflies, a new story was being written, not with words, but with the universal language of the heart. The Center for Inclusion and Assistive Technology was beginning to gain recognition. A particularly busy day brought an unexpected surprise. Lucas, a 12-year-old boy with a motor disability, discovered an innovative way to use the communication system created by Richard and Sophie. Using an adapted tablet, Lucas began to transform the symbols on the cards into musical notes. Each butterfly, each symbol, gained its own melody. What began as a game soon transformed into a revolutionary project. "Look at this," Lucas exclaimed excitedly, showing his discovery to Richard. On the tablet screen, blue butterflies danced to the sound of a soft melody he had created. Each color has a different sound, each movement a different note. Richard watched in wonder as the boy explained his system. Sophie, who was nearby drawing, raised her eyes with interest. For the first time in a long time, she spontaneously approached another child. "Do the butterflies sing?" she asked, her voice still shy but curious. Lucas smiled, adjusting his tablet. "Want to hear?" Together, the two began to create a unique symphony. Sophie drew, Lucas transformed the drawings into music. The sound attracted other patients and therapists who stopped their activities to observe this extraordinary collaboration. Elizabeth, who was conducting a physical therapy session nearby, couldn't contain her tears of emotion. Her daughter, who for weeks had communicated only through drawings, was interacting, talking, creating. "It's amazing," commented one of the occupational therapists approaching Richard. "We could adapt this system for other patients. Music therapy combined with visual symbols could open a world of possibilities." Richard was already making notes on his tablet. His business mind, now directed towards social good, began to see the ramifications of that accidental discovery. The communication system that had begun as a way to help Sophie could expand in directions they had never imagined. In the assistive technology room, a team immediately began working on developing an application that could make Lucas's discovery accessible to more people. The boy was invited to be the first consultant for the project, his eyes shining with pride as he saw his ideas being taken seriously. "You know," he said to Richard during one of the application development sessions, "before I thought being different was bad, but now I see that it's precisely our difference that allows us to create new things." Sophie, who had begun to regularly attend the application development sessions, complemented the thought with a new drawing, a blue butterfly carrying a musical note on its wings. The project quickly gained the attention of the scientific community. A renowned assistive technology magazine published an article about the initiative, highlighting how the combination of art, music, and technology was creating new possibilities for communication and expression. Helen, who had initially doubted the center's potential, appeared one afternoon to personally see the developments. She found the place busy, full of life and creativity. In one of the rooms, Lucas was conducting a workshop for other young people, teaching them how to use the musical system he had created. "I have to admit," she said to Richard, observing the activity, "this is much bigger than I imagined." Richard smiled, observing Sophie and Lucas working together on a new project. "Sometimes," he responded, "we need to put our preconceptions aside to see the true potential that exists in each person." At the end of that afternoon, as the sun was setting, a spontaneous group formed in the therapeutic garden. Lucas played his most recent composition through the application, while Sophie drew butterflies that seemed to dance to the sound of the music. Charlie, tending to his plants, smiled to see how his garden had transformed into a space of healing and creation. A blue butterfly, real and vivid, landed on Lucas's tablet, as if wanting to participate in that symphony of transformations. The boy looked at Sophie, who smiled in mutual understanding. They didn't need words to understand that they were part of something extraordinary. The growing notoriety of the center brought with it unexpected challenges. On an apparently ordinary morning, Richard was receiving another group of visitors interested in the project when an elegant woman, approximately 40 years old, caught his attention. She was observing Sophie with a disturbing intensity. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, approaching in his wheelchair. The woman turned, revealing eyes identical to Sophie's. "My name is Megan Sanders," she introduced herself, her voice trembling slightly. I'm Sophie's biological mother." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Richard felt his heart accelerate, memories of the last few months rapidly passing through his mind. The drawings, the discoveries, the moments of deep connection with the girl who had become so special in his life. "Elizabeth is in a session with a patient," he managed to say, maintaining his composure. "Perhaps we can talk in my office?" Megan nodded, following him. On the way, they passed through the therapeutic garden, where Sophie and Lucas were working on a new musical composition. The girl briefly raised her eyes, her gaze crossing with her biological mother's without recognition. In the office, Megan sat down, her restless hands on her lap. "I left her with Elizabeth when she was only 2 years old," she began. "At the time, I didn't have the emotional or financial conditions to care for a special child. Elizabeth, who was my neighbor and physical therapist, offered temporary help, but it ended up becoming something permanent." Richard listened attentively, his heart divided between compassion for that woman's story and the protective instinct he had developed toward Sophie. "And now," he asked softly, "what brings you back?" Megan took a deep breath. "I saw the report about the center on television. Sophie, she's so grown up, so talented. I want to be part of her life." Before Richard could respond, a soft sound interrupted them. Sophie was standing at the door, holding one of her communication cards. On it, a blue butterfly hovered over an empty cocoon. The girl silently entered the office, her eyes fixed on Megan. With deliberate movements, she began to arrange more cards on the table, a butterfly helping another to fly. 2 butterflies. Following different paths, a butterfly returning to the garden. Megan observed tears streaming down her face. Has she always been like this? So special? "Sophie has her own way of seeing and understanding the world," Richard responded with gentleness. She teaches us every day about acceptance, transformation, and unconditional love. The girl took her drawing pad and began to create something new. Her strokes were precise, determined. When she finished, she handed the drawing to Megan. It showed 3 butterflies, 1 large and 2 small, all connected by delicate threads of light. Family, Sophie said softly, can have many forms. Megan covered her mouth with her hands, emotional. At that moment, Elizabeth appeared at the door, paralyzed upon seeing the scene. Megan, she whispered, immediately recognizing her former neighbor. The silence that followed was interrupted by Lucas, who came running into the office with his tablet. Sophie, come see, the app is working with the new symbols. The girl looked at the adults, hesitant. Richard nodded encouragingly, and she left with Lucas, leaving behind an environment charged with emotions and possibilities. We need to talk, Elizabeth finally said, her voice firm but gentle. All of us. Richard observed the 2 women, thinking about how fate wove its webs in mysterious ways. A blue butterfly landed on the windowsill, its wings shining under the morning sun, as if observing that moment of transformation. Megan's reappearance caused waves of unrest at the center. Elizabeth, although outwardly calm, spent sleepless nights, worried about the impact this change could have on Sophie. Richard, in turn, began to discreetly research custody rights and adoption. The situation became even more complicated when Helen appeared with worrying news. We need to talk, she said, entering Richard's office with a grave expression. There are rumors circulating, people questioning the legitimacy of the center. What kind of rumors? Richard asked, already feeling a pang of concern. Helen extended a tablet with various headlines from blogs and websites. Inclusion Center under suspicion, irregular practices in social project, former CEO of Miller Technologies, philanthropy or fraud. This is absurd, Richard exclaimed, going through the reports with growing indignation. All our practices are transparent, documented. Yes, but someone is manipulating information, distorting data, Helen explained, sitting down heavily. And there's more. Some people are suggesting that you are not mentally fit to manage the project since the accident. The silence that followed was interrupted by a soft sound. Sophie was at the door, as she always appeared in the most important moments. She carried a new set of cards, and her eyes revealed that she had heard part of the conversation. She approached the table and began to arrange her cards. A butterfly facing a storm, several butterflies forming a protective shield, a small butterfly emerging stronger from a cocoon. Sophie is right, Richard said, a smile forming on his lips. We won't let this bring us down. At that moment, Lucas came running into the office, his tablet in hand. You need to see this, the music app. It's gone viral. On the screen, dozens of videos showed people around the world using the communication system created at the center. Children with different special needs, elderly people in rehabilitation, all connecting through the universal language of music and symbols. And there's more, Lucas continued, excited. A deaf girl in India adapted the system to create a tactile communication method. She uses the vibrations of the notes to communicate with other people. Helen observed everything with a mixture of surprise and admiration. This is extraordinary, she admitted. That's it, Richard exclaimed. That's how we'll respond to the accusations, not with words, but with real results. In the following days, the center mobilized. Patients, family members, and volunteers began to spontaneously share their stories on social media. Lucas organized an online concert with other young people who used the musical application, creating a global symphony of inclusion. Sophie, inspired by the movement, began to create a series of new drawings. Each one told the transformation story of someone from the center. Charlie, the gardener, got a special page. His blue butterfly carried gardening tools, transforming empty spaces into places of healing. Megan, who was following everything from a distance, sent an emotional letter to the center. In it, she explained that after seeing Sophie's flourishing, she understood that true motherhood was in the daily actions of love and care that Elizabeth had always provided. Perhaps, she wrote, my role in Sophie's life is as another butterfly, in her garden of transformations, not as the guardian of her flight. The letter brought peace to Elizabeth's heart, who finally managed to sleep an entire night. Richard, observing how everything was proceeding, began to realize that the adversities were, in fact, strengthening the center's community even more. On a particularly significant afternoon, as the sun was setting in the therapeutic garden, a spontaneous group formed. Lucas played a new composition, inspired by recent events. Sophie drew, her strokes more confident than ever. Charlie tended to his plants, now an integral part of many patients' therapeutic process. A blue butterfly, larger than normal, landed in the center of the garden. Everyone stopped to observe, captured by the magic of the moment. Sophie raised her new drawing. It showed the center as a large garden where butterflies of all colors and sizes flew freely, each at their own pace, all connected by invisible threads of understanding and acceptance. The wave of support for the center grew in an organic and powerful way. The stories shared on social networks reached the mainstream media, and soon a television station proposed making a documentary about the project. Richard, initially hesitant, agreed after consulting with the team and the families involved. But with one condition, he told the producer, a woman with a perceptive gaze named Claire Martin. The story needs to be told from their perspective. They are the real protagonists. Claire spent weeks at the center, documenting not just the successes, but also the daily challenges. She captured moments of frustration transformed into achievements, tears that converted into smiles, small progress that meant entire worlds to those who achieved them. Sophie, surprisingly, developed a special connection with Claire. The documentarian had a gentle way of approaching, respecting the girl's space and time. One day, while filming in the therapeutic garden, Sophie surprised her with a question. "Do you also see the stories that no one else sees?" Claire lowered her camera, intrigued. "What do you mean, dear?" Sophie took her drawing pad and began to explain through her illustrations. She showed how each person at the center carried an invisible story, represented by different types of butterflies. Some had damaged wings, others were just beginning to emerge from the cocoon, but all had their own special brilliance. "That's exactly what I'm trying to show," Claire responded, moved. "The stories that exist beyond what the eyes can see." The documentary began to take shape. Lucas created the soundtrack using his musical application, incorporating sounds from the garden and the voices of the center. Charlie appeared caring for his plants, explaining how each species had its own time to bloom, just like people. Elizabeth, in her testimony, spoke about how the center had become more than a workplace. It was a space of collective transformation. "Here," she said, "there are no limits, just different ways to fly." One day, during filming, Helen appeared with a surprise. Several business people, touched by the stories that were beginning to circulate, offered support to expand the project. "They want to create similar centers in other cities," she announced, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Richard listened to the proposal attentively, but his gaze was fixed on Sophie, who was drawing intently in her usual corner. "What do you think?" he asked the girl. "Should we help other butterflies find their garden?" Sophie raised her drawing in response. It showed several interconnected gardens, each with its own butterflies, but all connected by a common sky. "Butterflies need many gardens," she said softly, "because there are many ways to fly." Claire captured the moment with her camera, realizing that she was witnessing something precious. The transformation wasn't just of the patients or the center, it was of everyone who allowed themselves to be touched by that experience. At the end of that afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in golden tones, a special scene unfolded in the garden. Lucas played a new melody, soft and engaging. Sophie danced with her paper butterflies, each movement telling a story. Charlie watered his plants, whose flowers seemed to move to the rhythm of the music. Elizabeth observed everything, with tearful eyes, feeling a deep gratitude for being part of that story. Richard, at her side, increasingly understood that his greatest achievement wasn't in business awards or the numbers in his bank account, but in the smiles and small victories he witnessed every day. Claire, filming discreetly, captured the exact moment when a real blue butterfly landed on Sophie's shoulder. The girl didn't move, just smiled, as if sharing a secret with her winged visitor. In the background, Lucas's music seemed to cradle that magical encounter between two worlds. "Sometimes," Sophie whispered to the camera, "we need to lose our old wings to discover that we can fly in a different way." While the center flourished globally, a personal challenge appeared on the horizon. Megan, Sophie's biological mother, sent a formal letter requesting visitation rights. The news fell like a bomb in the harmonious environment they had built. "Does she have that right?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling as she consulted Richard in his office. After all these years, Richard, who had already extensively researched the subject, maintained his calm. "Legally, it's a complex situation, but I think we should first consider what's best for Sophie." As if invoked by the mention of her name, Sophie appeared at the office door. Her eyes, always perceptive, caught the tension in the environment. Without saying a word, she began to draw. The drawing that emerged under her skilled fingers showed 3 butterflies, a large blue one clearly representing Elizabeth, a smaller one also blue, which would be herself, and a third in a lighter tone flying at a certain distance. "Family," Sophie said softly, "can have many forms." Richard and Elizabeth exchanged emotional looks. The wisdom contained in those simple words was profound. "What do you want, my love?" Elizabeth asked gently. Sophie took another sheet and began to draw again. This time she showed a large garden where all butterflies had space to fly, each at their own pace and direction. "Everyone can have a place in the garden," she explained, "as long as they respect others' flight." The solution began to take shape naturally. Megan was invited to learn about the center's work, not just as Sophie's biological mother, but as someone who could contribute with her own transformation story. During her first visit, Megan was impressed with the welcoming environment and mainly with Sophie's extraordinary development. The girl whom she had left as a baby out of fear of not knowing how to deal with her particularities was now a source of inspiration for people around the world. "You've built something incredible here," Megan said to Elizabeth, her words laden with recognition and respect. "Sophie has exactly what she needs to flourish." Lucas, who was observing the interaction from afar, began to play a soft melody on his application. The notes seemed to give voice to the feelings flowing in the environment. Charlie, working in his garden, smiled to see how the blue butterflies seemed more numerous that day, as if celebrating that moment of reconciliation and understanding. I know," he commented to Richard, who was observing everything from his wheelchair. "Sometimes the strongest plants grow precisely in places where there has been a storm." At the end of that afternoon, everyone gathered in the garden for a special moment. Sophie had prepared a presentation combining her drawings with Lucas's music. The images told the story of a small butterfly that discovered it could have more than one garden to call home. Megan, watching the presentation, finally understood that her role in Sophie's life didn't need to be that of a protagonist, but could be significant in its own way. "Sometimes," she said to Elizabeth, "the greatest act of love is knowing how to step aside and applaud from afar." Elizabeth, in a gesture of profound generosity, extended her hand to Megan. "How you will always be part of her story, and now you can be part of this story in a new way." A blue butterfly, larger than normal, landed between the two women, its wings shining under the evening light. Sophie, who was drawing nearby, captured the moment on her paper. 2 adult butterflies guiding a smaller one, all connected by invisible threads of understanding and love. The success of the center brought an important decision for Richard. After much reflection and conversations with Elizabeth, he decided to take a significant step, to request legal adoption of Sophie. The decision wasn't taken lightly. It was the natural result of months of coexistence and a bond that grew stronger each day. "Are you sure?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and concern. "It's an enormous responsibility." Richard smiled, looking through the office window where Sophie was playing in the garden with other children. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," he answered. "She's already my daughter in all the ways that matter. Now I want to make it official." The news was received with joy by the center's team. Lucas composed a special music for the occasion, using the sounds of the garden and the melodies Sophie liked most. Charlie prepared a special flower bed with the girls' favorite flowers. On the day of the hearing with the judge, Sophie surprised everyone. When asked about her desire to be adopted by Richard, she didn't hesitate. "I always wanted a father who could see butterflies where others only see problems," she said, her voice clear and confident. The judge, touched by the response, smiled. "And how do you know he's that father?" he asked gently. Sophie took her folder of drawings and showed a sequence of illustrations. Richard, in his wheelchair in the garden, teaching other people to use the communication system, smiling while she played music with Lucas, patiently listening to her stories about butterflies. "Because he doesn't try to fix my different wings," she explained. "He helps me fly in my own way." The adoption was formalized that same day. The celebration at the center was spontaneous and moving. Patients, staff, and family members gathered in the garden where Lucas and his music therapy group presented a special composition. Megan, who had been invited to the celebration, observed everything with a serene smile. She had found her place in that story, not as a protagonist, but as an important part of the past that had led to this happy moment. During the party, Sophie called everyone for a surprise. With Lucas's help, she had prepared a special presentation. On the big screen installed in the garden, images of blue butterflies danced to the sound of soft music, while her voice narrated a story. Once upon a time, there was a small butterfly that was born with different wings. She didn't know how to fly like the others, but discovered she could dance in her own way. One day she found a special garden where all butterflies were different. There she learned that she didn't need to change her wings. She just needed to find her own music to dance to. While the presentation continued, real blue butterflies began to appear in the garden, as if attracted by the energy of the moment. Charlie, who knew every inch of the garden, had never seen so many at once. "It's a sign," he whispered to Helen, who watched everything with emotion. "The universe has its own way of celebrating important moments." Richard, observing his, now, officially daughter shining in her special moment, felt a deep gratitude. The accident that seemed to have destroyed his life had, in fact, opened the door to a much more meaningful existence. Elizabeth approached, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You are living proof that family is not something found only in blood," she said softly. "We are proof that the greatest transformations happen when we stop trying to fly as others expect," Richard responded, his eyes watery with emotion. Sophie ran to them, her eyes shining with joy. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing to the sky. A formation of blue butterflies seemed to dance in the air, creating patterns that resembled musical notes. "They're singing our song," Sophie said, hugging her adoptive father. In that moment, Richard understood that his greatest achievement wasn't the center, nor its international success. It was having learned through Sophie that sometimes we need to lose our old wings to discover that we can fly in much more extraordinary ways. With the family officially established, the center entered a new phase of growth. The communication system developed by Sophie and Lucas was being implemented in schools and rehabilitation centers around the world. Each adaptation brought new discoveries and possibilities. One afternoon, while Richard was conducting a video conference with international partners, Helen burst into his office with a concerned expression. "We have a problem," she announced, showing her tablet. "Someone is trying to discredit the center." On the screen, sensationalist headlines accused the project of irregular practices and questioned the legitimacy of the innovations developed there. The source of the accusations was anonymous, but the style of the report suggested an orchestrated campaign. "Some investors are already questioning their partnerships," Helen continued. "We need to act quickly." Richard remained calm, years of business experience helping him maintain perspective. "Call a meeting with the entire team," he instructed. "We'll face this with transparency." The news spread quickly through the center. Lucas was the first to react, organizing a group of young people who used his musical application. "We can show the world what really happens here," he proposed, his eyes shining with determination. Sophie, who had grown much in her capacity for expression, had an even more ambitious idea. With the help of Claire, the documentarian who had become a close friend, she began to collect transformation stories of people impacted by the center. Each butterfly has its own story, she explained, organizing drawings and testimonials. Let's let them speak for us. The movement began small but grew organically. Families shared their experiences on social media. Health professionals published studies on the benefits of the methodologies developed at the center. Volunteers organized events to demonstrate the real impact of the project in their communities. Charlie, in his therapeutic garden, continued his silent but profound work. "Plants don't lie," he told visitors who questioned the center's methods. "They grow because they find the right environment to flourish here. The same happens with people." Elizabeth, who was initially shaken by the accusations, found strength in the spontaneous reaction of the community. "Look," she said during a meeting, "we are not just a rehabilitation center. We are an extended family where each person finds space to be who they are." The response to the accusations came in an unexpected way. Sophie, using the communication system she had helped create, produced a visual manifesto that went viral on the internet. They were simple but powerful images. Real people, real stories, real transformations. "Butterflies don't need to prove they can fly," she wrote in her conclusion. "They just fly, each in their own way." The impact was immediate. The shared stories began to naturally deny the accusations. More than that, they transformed the center into a symbol of resistance and hope. Helen, who had feared the worst, observed with admiration how the crisis was transforming into opportunity. "It's incredible," she commented to Richard. "The more they try to bring us down, the stronger we become." "It's because we've built something real," Richard responded, observing through the window where several blue butterflies danced in the garden. "Something that cannot be destroyed by empty words." Lucas, inspired by the events, created a new function in his application, a space where people could share their transformation stories through music and images. "This way," he explained, "no one needs to face their challenges alone." At the end of that turbulent week, the center was stronger than ever. The community that had formed in its defense had created even deeper bonds. The blue butterflies, which seemed more numerous than normal, danced through the garden as if celebrating yet another transformation. A quiet morning was interrupted by a shrill alarm. The electrical system of the old house where the center operated had short-circuited, causing a fire to break out. The evacuation was quick and organized, thanks to the well-established safety protocols. Charlie was the last to leave after ensuring that all his plants were safe. The fire department arrived quickly and managed to control the flames, but the damage was already done. A significant part of the original structure was compromised. Sophie, embraced by Elizabeth and Richard, observed the scene with silent tears. In her drawing folder, which she never left behind, the blue butterflies seemed darker than normal. "We lost everything," Helen murmured, looking at the still smoking rubble. "No," Richard responded firmly, his voice calm, contrasting with the chaos around. "We lost a structure. What we built here, the connections, the transformations, the community that no one can take from us." As if responding to his words, something extraordinary began to happen. Families who had been helped by the center began to arrive. Volunteers appeared with tools and materials. The news spread quickly through social networks, and soon a true chain of solidarity formed. Lucas, using his musical application, began to coordinate the volunteers through an improvised symphony. Each workgroup had its own melody, creating a unique harmony as they cleaned and reorganized the space. Sophie, recovering her spirit, began to draw plans for the new center. Her drawings showed a space even more integrated with nature, where Charlie's garden extended throughout the entire grounds. "Look," she explained to a group of volunteer architects who offered to help with the reconstruction, "the butterflies need more space to dance." Charlie, although saddened by the loss of part of his garden, found hope in the shoots that were already beginning to emerge among the rubble. "Nature always finds a way," he said, showing everyone a small plant that had survived. The reconstruction became a community project. Each person who had been touched by the center's work wanted to contribute in some way. Artists offered works to decorate the new walls. Companies donated materials and equipment. Professionals from various areas offered their time and expertise. During this period, the center's activities didn't stop. Classes and therapies happened in improvised spaces, outdoors when the weather permitted. Somehow, this forced adaptation ended up creating new possibilities for integration and learning. Elizabeth observed that her patients seemed to respond even better to physical therapy when conducted in nature. It's as if the environment itself participated in the healing process, she commented. 1 month after the incident, during a break in the construction, everyone gathered in the garden for an improvised celebration. Lucas had composed special music for the occasion, combining construction sounds with nature's melodies. Sophie, who had been especially thoughtful in recent days, presented her newest drawing. It showed the old center transforming into an enormous blue butterfly from which several smaller butterflies were born. Sometimes, she explained to the emotional audience, we need to lose our old wings to discover that we can fly even higher. Richard, observing his daughter with pride, understood that the incident, although painful, had been one more necessary transformation in their collective journey. The new center that emerged from the rubble would be even more special, because it would carry in its walls the stories and love of an entire community. That night, as the last volunteers were leaving, a magical scene unfolded in the partially reconstructed garden. Dozens of blue butterflies appeared, landing gently on the new flower beds and structures. It was as if nature was giving its own blessing to the rebirth of the space. The new center, affectionately named Butterfly Haven, emerged more beautiful and functional than before. The reconstruction brought innovations that no one had initially imagined. Charlie's garden now naturally integrated with the therapy spaces, creating an environment where the line between treatment and nature became increasingly tenuous. On a particularly significant morning, Charlie faced an emotional relapse. The weight of memories from the accident he had caused with Richard years ago, added to the stress of reconstruction, hit him with full force. Richard found the gardener sitting alone on one of the garden benches, his hands trembling slightly as he held a plant seedling. Without saying anything, he maneuvered his wheelchair to sit beside him. Sometimes, Charlie began, his voice choked, I look at all this and can't believe I deserved a second chance. Richard smiled gently. You know what I learned from Sophie's butterflies? That it's not a question of deserving. It's a question of accepting transformation when it comes. At that moment, Sophie appeared silently, carrying one of her drawings. It showed 2 intertwined butterflies, one made of flowers and another of wheelchair wheels. The strongest butterflies, she said softly, are those that learn to fly after breaking their wings. The simple wisdom of those words deeply touched both men. Charlie wiped his eyes and, with a new gleam in his gaze, began to show Sophie how to plant the seedling he was holding. The impact of the center continued to spread. An international documentarian, inspired by the work developed there, began to collect similar stories around the world. In different countries, people reported mysterious encounters with blue butterflies in moments of personal transformation. It's as if the butterflies were messengers, commented the documentarian during an interview with Richard. They appear when someone is about to discover their true strength. Lucas, who had become a young, internationally recognized music therapist, was now developing a project to create musical gardens in pediatric hospitals. Each garden, he explained, will have its own healing symphony. Elizabeth, observing all these ramifications of the work they had initiated, felt a deep gratitude. When we started, she said during a team meeting, we thought we were creating a rehabilitation center. In reality, we were planting seeds of transformation. Butterfly Haven became a pilgrimage point for people seeking hope and renewal. Each visitor was received with the same gentle question from Sophie. What kind of butterfly do you want to be? The answers varied, but all carried the same deep desire for transformation. And curiously, many reported that after their visit, they began to notice blue butterflies in significant moments of their lives. Helen, who remained a constant presence in the project, though now more as a friend than an executive, commented, once, Perhaps the butterflies were always there, we just needed to learn to see them. During a quiet afternoon, while Sophie and Lucas rehearsed a new composition in the garden, Richard observed the movement of butterflies among the flowers. Charlie cared for his plants with serene dedication, and Elizabeth guided a group of new physical therapists. A blue butterfly larger than the others landed on the arm of his wheelchair. Sophie, who had stopped her music to observe, smiled with knowledge. "She's saying the story isn't over yet," the girl commented. "There are still many transformations to come." Richard nodded, understanding that each end was just the beginning of a new cycle of transformations. The blue butterflies would continue their silent work, guiding those who were ready to discover their own wings. 5 years had passed since the foundation of the first center. What had begun as a local project now spread across different continents. Similar centers were flourishing in various countries, each adapting the original concept to their own cultures and needs. On a special morning, Richard observed the preparations for the celebration of the family's anniversary, the day when his adoption of Sophie had been formalized. The garden was especially beautiful, with Charlie having dedicated weeks to ensure that each flower was in its perfect moment of blooming. Sophie, now an articulate and sensitive preteen, had become a kind of unofficial chronicler of the center. Her journals, full of drawings and stories, documented not only her personal journey, but the transformations of everyone who passed through there. "Dad," she called, entering Richard's office with a new notebook in hand, "I found something interesting in the old archives." It was a photo from the day of the accident, taken by an amateur photographer who was passing by the street. In it, one could clearly see a blue butterfly flying over the scene, its wings shining under the nightlight. "The butterflies have always been guiding us," Sophie commented softly, "even when we didn't know it." Lucas, who had become the director of the music therapy department, entered the office excitedly. "You need to see this," he exclaimed, showing his tablet. On the screen, videos from different parts of the world showed people using variations of the communication system they had developed. "It's amazing," he continued. "Each place adds something new, but the essence remains the same. The music, the colors, the butterflies." Elizabeth appeared at the door carrying a surprise, the first drawing Sophie had made for Richard while he was still in the hospital. The paper was a little yellowed, but the blue butterflies remained as vivid as on the first day. "I found this while organizing the archives for the celebration," she explained, her eyes shining with contained tears. Helen, who arrived for the party preparations, stopped to observe the drawing. "Who would have thought," she commented, "that a child's drawing would transform into a global movement of transformation?" The celebration gathered people from different parts of the world. Stories were shared in various languages, but all carried the same theme: transformation, renewal, hope. Charlie had prepared small pots with plant seedlings for each guest, symbolizing the continuity of growth. During the party, Sophie climbed onto the small stage set up in the garden. At her side, Lucas prepared himself with his musical instruments. Together, they had prepared a special presentation. "When I was younger," Sophie began, her voice clear and confident, "I thought being different was something bad. But then I learned that the most beautiful butterflies are those that find their own way to fly." The music began softly, accompanying her words. On screens around the garden, images of different centers around the world alternated, showing how the small seed planted there had spread. "Each person who passes through our gardens," she continued, "takes a bit of this magic with them, and sometimes when they least expect it, a blue butterfly appears to remind them that transformation never ends." Richard, observing his daughter with pride, realized that she had become much more than a girl who drew butterflies. She was a guardian of stories, a weaver of hopes, a chronicler of transformations. At that moment, as if responding to a silent call, dozens of blue butterflies appeared in the garden, dancing among the guests. The phenomenon, recorded by cameras and cell phones, would soon become another of the magical coincidences associated with the center. Sophie came down from the stage and approached Richard, Elizabeth, and Helen. Charlie joined them, carrying one of his special plants. Lucas completed the circle, the music still softly echoing in the background. "We are all butterflies," Sophie said simply, looking at each one. Some still in the cocoon, others learning to fly, but all in transformation. The celebration night continued in the garden of Butterfly Haven. The soft lights illuminated the smiling faces, while stories were shared and new connections formed. Sophie circulated among the guests with her drawing notebook, collecting more stories for her growing collection of transformations. Megan, who had found her place as a volunteer at the center, chatted animatedly with a group of parents about the importance of accepting each child's different timing. Her own transformation journey had become a source of inspiration for many. "Sometimes," she said, "we need to get lost to find our true path." Charlie, in his favorite corner of the garden, showed a group of international visitors how each plant had its role in the healing process. His hands, once trembling with guilt, now moved confidently among the flowers and leaves. Lucas coordinated an improvised musical group where patients from different countries created a unique harmony using the application he had developed. The melodies mixed with the natural sound of the garden, creating a symphony of celebration. Elizabeth observed everything with tearful eyes, remembering the long road traveled. Helen, at her side, had completely left behind her former corporate persona, now fully dedicated to the global expansion of the project. Richard gathered everyone for a special moment. Sophie, at his side, held a new drawing covered by a cloth. "When I had the accident," he began, his voice loaded with emotion, "I thought my life was over, but in reality it was just beginning. Each person here is part of this rebirth story." Sophie removed the cloth, revealing her most ambitious drawing, yet a mural where hundreds of blue butterflies formed a large world map. Each butterfly represented a center or project inspired by Butterfly Haven. "Butterflies know no borders," she explained, "just as transformation knows no limits." Lucas initiated a soft melody, and soon other voices joined, creating a spontaneous harmony. Charlie distributed small plant seedlings, each with a blue butterfly drawn by Sophie on the pot. Megan approached Elizabeth and Sophie, embracing them in an emotional hug. "You taught me that true love is knowing how to let fly," she whispered. Helen, who had documented the center's entire journey, announced that a new documentary was in production, this time focusing on transformation stories around the world. "Each story is a butterfly," she said, "bringing hope to new gardens." Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To le farfal," he said, using the Italian word for butterflies that Sophie so loved. "To the transformations we've already lived," Elizabeth completed. "And to those yet to come," Sophie finalized. At that moment, as if in a last magical gift of the night, a single large blue butterfly landed on Richard's shoulder. Everyone observed in reverent silence as it gently opened and closed its wings, as if blessing that moment. Sophie smiled, understanding the profound meaning of that instant. In her notebook, she began to sketch her next story. Not an end, but a new beginning. Because, as she had learned, each transformation is just the beginning of another even more extraordinary one.